1916. Most of the men and boys left to fight in World War I, leaving their loved ones behind. Reverend A.D. Harmon left that summer to travel, becoming a well-paid speaker of Chautauqua. His reputation as an inspiring speaker was growing. He was one of the first ministers to speak on the radio. That fall, he took the position of college president of Transylvania College in Lexington, Kentucky.
Reverend Robert Huffman, our student minister born in Ireland, returned for nearly a year, this time ordained. He also preached in Drummond. Our church went without a regular pastor for 2 years. Dignified speakers from the faculty of Northland College would come down to Cable to preach. Members of the Harmon family would also fill in preaching or playing the organ.
Marguerite Harmon met Alvin Breaux while they were both students at Northland College. They married in March of 1918. Alvin, who would become ordained the following year, conducted services at our church summer of 1918 and spent lots of time meeting farmers who settled in the newly opened cutover land between Cable and Drummond. Marguerite and Alvin then became missionaries in China for 6 years. Our church helped to support their work.
Reverend William A. Allen, born in England and ordained in Baptist Church in Michigan, preached for a short time in 1919. Then Reverend George Henry Waters, born in England, ordained in Chicago, journeyed from Washburn to hold Sunday evening worship for 1 year, beginning in 1920. The Lutherans began holding services on Sunday afternoons in our church the following year, renting our building for $1 per Sunday. We later lowered the price to 50 cents.
In 1922, Thomas Weiler preached for a short period of time, followed by John C. Robertson, a student minister for a couple of years. Charlotte Fisk Reynolds remembers him as a slim man. That winter, a big snowstorm hit our area. August Rasmussen and son Carl took horses and sleigh with groceries and cattle feed, breaking a trail to the Hoffman home north of Totogatik Lake, where the family and livestock were out of food. A courageous journey.
Henry Fisk, father of Charlotte Reynolds and Marge Ohm, installed the first telephone service available to the entire village. Frederick W. Ring, another student minister, served our church in 1924 for 1 year. Henry Fisk wired the church with electricity in 1925, presenting our church with the first electric bill.
Next came Reverend Iona Brocious, in 1926, born in Ohio, ordained in Iowa. Though Reverend Brocious only remained here a year, little Charlotte Fisk, who we know as Charlotte Reynolds, remembers Miss Brocious.
She lived in a little house on Highway M. My mother, my 2 brothers, and I went over there. We kneeled on the kitchen floor and she baptized us. The church considered us members then. Nowadays, you become a full member after confirmation or when you join as an adult. I've been a member for 78 years. Back then, there were no trees in the village, only twigs of trees. They'd all been logged off.
In a letter from our church's clerk to the state church office, quote, while the work here has suffered sadly through the misadministration of our last pastor, we are not absolutely discouraged, but are holding on, and a few of us at least are hopeful that we will be able to make a more rapid recovery. Thomas Riggers was pastor briefly in 1928, during the time when Prohibition ended. New taverns and restaurants sprouted up. The times were hard. From the 1929 annual meeting report, our sources of income were sadly demoralized, and we were not able to pay Mr. Rittgers what he really deserved. But we did manage to raise a nominal compensation, which he graciously accepted.
Reverend William Henry Ziegler, publisher of the Palmyra Enterprise newspaper in Palmyra, Wisconsin, was invited to be pastor. Born in Chicago and ordained in Illinois, he wrote to the church,
"If I can sell my newspaper at the full asking price, I could then afford to accept the cable church's salary of $1,500 per year. I also appreciate your offer of providing me a modern house with a furnace, a bathroom, and electric lights."
Reverend Ziegler did sell his newspaper and became the pastor for 2 years. The conference paid for half his salary. Someone commented, "He has not only won the hearts of the membership, but has won a warm place for the church and himself, as well with many citizens of the community who are not members of the church. It is well evident that he is the right man in the right place."
Mrs. Ziegler was in charge of Sunday school. Marge Fisk-Ohm remembers,
When I was around 4 years old, one morning I followed my big brothers and sister Charlotte to Sunday school. My mother was frantic and searched for me. When she arrived at the Sunday school, Mrs. Ziegler said very kindly to my mother,
Marjorie is here, but be gentle to her because she belongs here.
Sunday school increased in size with 36 youth attended each Sunday. Construction was started on the church, adding a basement and 2 church parlors to the rear of the building and new arched windows in the sanctuary. During construction, church services were held in the town hall. After that, there was even 14 cents left in our building account.
After Reverend Ziegler left in 1930, Reverend Richard DeForest Orton, born in Wisconsin and ordained in Presbyterian Church in Ashland, who served a church in Hayward also, served our church for a year. Around this time, some missionaries came to town, and a large number of our church members were attracted to their style of preaching, the born-again style. Half of our members, including most of the Sunday school teachers, abandoned our church to form the Christian Missionary Alliance Church. For a long time, there were hard feelings between neighbors and families. A member of our church remembers overhearing someone say,
"Those Congregationalists are nothing but independent thinkers."
When it came time to make dollar pledges for the church, Dr. Kate Kelsey summed up the general feeling of the church members.
I will pledge $4 for this entire year if Harmon is hired back. $2 if he is not.
though Reverend Dr. Harmon was retired, he returned to our church, this time serving for nearly 20 years. People rejoiced, and some journeyed 100 miles to hear Dr. Harmon preach. The Harmons helped organize what was left of the church and build it back up. The church was transformed on some weeknights into a dining room, social room, or lecture hall. The publication Wisconsin Congregational Church Life wrote,
Debates on vital social issues are frequently held. Moral questions are faced with courage. Under the determined leadership of the pastor, slot machines were driven out and kept out of the community.
In the 1940s, there was talk that Babyface Nelson's gang came through our town wanting food and shelter at Anderson's place at the end of Kimball's Road. In the spring of 1944, 16-year-old Myron Nelson, that's no relation to Babyface, announced to his parents that he was no longer going to attend the Christian Missionary Alliance Sunday School and church. He remembers his mother not flinching at his announcement. She just kept on working at the stove, not even turning around. She asked,
All right, but where will you be going?
I wasn't planning to go anywhere. To the Congregational Church.
Myron attended Sunday school and visited our church the following Sunday. He remembers,
After hearing Dr. Harmon preach several times, I left with the feeling that God was not Republican and that the local bar was the stop-off on the way to hell. I also remember the Harmons would make unexpected pastoral visits. When we heard they were back in town, 30-second house cleaning was done in a frenzy by everyone, and Mother usually managed to change clothes during that time. The calls were quite formal, but probably never lasted over 20 minutes. My parents began attending the Congregational Church as a result of one of these calls.
John Chappell, managing editor of the Ashland Daily Press, summed up his admiration for the Reverend Harmon when he wrote in a tribute article,
"There are few men in the nation or the world like Dr. Harmon, who make your mind and heart tingle with the conviction that what he says is pure, good, and true. If world officials would face complicated problems by asking what would be best for the human family, what would be best for that circle of relationships that binds a man, his wife, and their children together, as Dr. Harmon and their children are bound together, a great many of world problems would disappear."
Reverend H. Brumbaugh served as a supply pastor for a time in 1948 when Reverend Harmon's health failed. Members of the Harmon family also filled in as needed during this period, including Nathaniel Dexter, Harriet Harmon Dexter, and Reverend Harmon's spouse, Alice Harmon. Another lot was purchased for the church from Jeanette Perry for $300. Though the church was expanding, Dr. Harmon's health continued to fail. A search for a new pastor was necessary. Dr. Harmon died in 1952, 2 years after retiring from being pastor of our church. His obituary stated,
"He thrilled many audiences with addresses before school graduation crowds and on other civic occasions. Dr. Harmon was in so great demand that he could not possibly respond to all of them. However, Mrs. Harmon was likewise a gifted speaker, and on various occasions, especially during the spring graduation season, he would be the principal speaker in one community and she in another on the same evening. Dr. Harmon had received his honorary doctor's degree from Cotner College in Lincoln, Nebraska, where he had served as president. At the funeral services, Reverend Jenkins, our next pastor, spoke these words.
His was a life lived for thee. We are stronger for having known him. We are better for having associated with him. Help us to be truer because of him."
3 of Reverend Harmon's grandchildren are summer worshipers in our congregation today: Alice, Allie Racher, Hank Reif, and Ken Brohl.
Let's celebrate the Harmon era.
Harriet Harmon married Nathaniel Dexter, professor at Northland College. He preached at our church. Dapper Henry Harmon became president of Drake. The Harmons were serious, but not outside of church.
They returned to the north, serving our church again. People would travel miles to hear Harmon and kin.
Marguerite married Alvin Breaux in 1918. She typed her memories of camping on Cable Lake for her family and for all of us, too. Allie and Manny married on the porch on the lake.
They returned to the north, serving our church again. People would travel miles to hear Harmon and kin.
You may visit Dr. Harmon's gravesite in Cable. Here's a Harmon descendant, Kim Brough, and his bride. Kim's the director of Sigurd Olson Institute. He married Becky Brown here in 1985.
They returned to the north, serving our church again. People would travel miles to hear Harmon and kin.
This is Alice Neer, who lived in Cable with her family. Her father was Dr. Neer, and her mother, Edna, was part of our church's choir for nearly 50 years. Edna also served as church treasurer for 31 years. Alice played piano with the choir during her high school years. The Nears lived on Nears Pond, just south of Cable, and in the winter many youth would skate on the pond. Alice is Linda Hallen's mother. Linda and her son Leaf often visit our church, and Linda sometimes sings in the choir.
Dr. Harmon had met Reverend Joseph H. Jenkins when he visited our church. Joe was the ideal candidate to serve our church. Dr. Harmon wrote to him in Danville, Illinois, "The church people in Cable liked the sermon you preached here during vacation. From then till now, you have been in constant mention as a possible pastor. In last night's meeting, your name met with unanimous cordiality and approval as a man to whom the church would like to extend a call."
In one letter of correspondence to Reverend Harmon, Reverend Jenkins wrote,
I thought all along there were no personality problems in the church, and I was glad to have you confirm this. We have always had much respect and love for Cable church folk, and we are now grateful for this evidence of their trust in us. I'm not by nature a short-term man. Also, I've learned that a man with children in school isn't exactly a free creature. We trust your health has been good and that those legs allow you to get out and enjoy the handiwork of that one who somehow has the patience to make each tiny leaf a masterpiece of glory. Sincerely, Joseph Jenkins.
When the field superintendent, Charles Wicks, heard Reverend Jenkins was considering coming to Cable, he wrote,
"The news of your interest in the pastorate was like a beacon in a dark night. A favorable reply would set the joy bells ringing."
In 1950, after the school year ended, Reverend Joe Jenkins' spouse, Lois, and children, David, Paul, Jim, and Janet, and Joe Jr., came to Cable to serve our church. He also served churches in Delta and Spider Lake. When Reverend Jenkins first arrived, some of the townspeople shook their heads and moaned.
It'll never be the same. He'll never be able to fill Dr. Harmon's shoes.
The Duluth News-Tribune wrote, Reverend Joe never planned to fill Dr. Harmon's shoes. He just went to work making footprints of his own.
Reverend Jenkins continued the church's commitment to the community, and our little church continued to be known for good preaching and good music.
Joseph H. Jenkins was born in the little town of Minersville, Pennsylvania, in 1901, the third of 6 children. His father had come from Wales and had worked in the mines. At a young age, Joe was inspired by a sophisticated and well-educated minister who came to the little church in Pottsville, 2 miles from where he lived. Joe's parents had already decided they would send their son to college to make a better life for himself.
When Joe was 19 years old, he saw a sign in a building in Chicago, visit the beautiful Northwoods. That sounded like a grand idea. He hitchhiked north, getting a ride from a man who lived near Iron River and who helped him to get a job at a resort in the Barnes-Solon Springs area. Being versatile, Joe swept floors, washed dishes, waited tables, and on Saturday nights, he played his fiddle for dances. During that summer, he never heard of or set foot in Cable, but he fell in love with the beautiful Northwoods.
Joe Jenkins did his undergraduate work at Oberlin College in Ohio, getting a degree in chemistry. Though he was offered a job with a big company, he had other plans. He went to Chicago Theological Seminary and became ordained in 1928 at age 27, then went on to take a pre-med course. Joe returned to this northern area for years with a classmate to fish, and they'd come to our church on Sundays to hear the top-notch speaker, Dr. Harmon.
Joe's spouse, Lois, had been born in Belmont, Iowa. Joe and Lois journeyed to the Cable area to a primitive cabin until he went into the service during World War II. He served overseas in India and Persia for 2.5 years, while Lois remained in Harvey, Illinois, with their 2 young boys. Though she had family who helped out, it was hard times when Joe first went into the service. When he returned, Lois's brother and Joe purchased the land on Lake Willie Pyro, and her father built the cabin. Lois recalls, "We had been serving a church in Danville, Illinois for 2.5 years when we started getting letters from the church in Cable asking if we'd go there. I was perfectly content in the large city of 150,000 people, but Joe really wanted to go to Cable. But Joe also wanted to finish up 3 years in Danville, and they said they would wait. Besides, we had to wait for our baby to be born, Joey. We moved into a house on Main Street and lived there until he retired in 1982. They were great years. We saw many people come and go. Sometimes our home felt like an open house. Kids would come in through the back door, and some would go out through the front door. Our children loved growing up there."
Joe became a leader in many community activities. The Jenkins helped to raise money for the ambulance and Cable for their day and night availability, and Lois and he were EMTs. Joe became a charter member of the Lions Club and was one of the founders of the Shawamigan Symphony Orchestra, where he played violin for many years.
Reverend Jenkins had been inspired by Dr. Harmon's annual nature sermons. He remembered Dr. Harmon saying,
"I have grown taller because I have walked with trees."
Joe Jenkins started the community nature lectures, which were held on alternate Wednesdays in Cable and Nemacagan. Mr. and Mrs. Burke became interested in the nature series. With their financial support, Lois Nestle's expertise, and the Reverend Jenkins' imagination and energy, the Cable Natural History Museum was formed. The museum continues the Joseph Jenkins Nature Lecture Series to date.
And what changes occurred in our church? The men of the church put a complete basement under the church building. Among the many workers were Hans Rasmussen, Andre Rasmussen, and Dan Bracken. Pilgrim Hall and a kitchen were built, which served fellowship purposes.
In 1958, we burned the mortgage of the church, and the congregation voted to operate independently of all missionary aid. What a big step, deciding to walk alone. But if the going became difficult, we could always send an SOS to the conference office. These big news items made it into the Church Life publication that year.
In 1957, the Evangelical and Reformed Church and the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches had acted to form the United Church of Christ. In 1959, Reverend Jenkins led this congregation in voting unanimously to enter the uniting denominations that became the United Church of Christ, that they may all be one.
In the 1960s, another lot was purchased for the church from Harold Schultz for $100. Jack Kramer became contractor for the new enclosed entrance and the Alice Gad Harmon study for the minister. A bathroom was built. No more using the outdoor toilet. No more pushing over the outhouse on Halloween night like Marjorie Fisk, pictured above here, now known as Marge Ohm, and her wild friends used to do. And one time there had been a man in it. In the early 70s, we decided to get a stained glass window. Some wanted the windows inside the chapel in colored glass, but after much discussion, we decided to stay with the Protestant tradition, keeping things simple and plain. So we voted on a stained glass window in the foyer, and we dedicated all these new additions, except the bathroom.
In 1972, we got a big surprise. Do you remember that $200 mortgage from 1902 that we got in order to purchase the old school building, to move it, and to buy the lot? Surprise, surprise. No one ever paid it off. Fortunately, it was without interest from the New York Church Building Society, and the embarrassed church board paid the mortgage.
Lois's contributions to the church have been numerous. As a young woman, she joined the Congregational Ladies' Aid, which later became the Christian Women's Fellowship, in which she is still active today. She has supported the church in this organization with the other women over the years. When she came to our church, she believed Mrs. Harmon was a tough act to follow. But Lois has paved her own way, enjoying many years of singing in the choir and admitting to sometimes giving Doris a hard time because she and the other choir members would have so much fun. Some people in the community think our church has too much fun. One woman once said indignantly, referring to Lois's mother, Mrs. Edith Stapley, "Mrs. Edith Stapley is the only pious-looking woman in that church."
When Lois came, it was expected of the minister's wife to run the church school. Back then, the church got 2 people for the price of 1. For many years, she led the church school children of various ages with her wisdom, humor, and patience.
I ran out of patience after a while with the class of 10 and 11-year-old boys. Back then, when we had Sunday school before the church service, those boys wouldn't sit still in class. One would have to go to the bathroom, another wanted a drink of water. One day, I stood up at the beginning of class with a stern look on my face when one boy hopped out of his seat and I said, "Today you are going to listen and sit still." He replied,
But Mrs. Jenkins, I was only getting up to get you a chair.
I was getting too cranky, so the other Sunday school teachers, back then all parents helped out, insisted that I take over the younger kids, and they would handle the older boys. All I said to them was, "Good luck." And one time at a church school sleepover, some kids were wild. Pauline made them go sit on the steps of the old study and read the Bible. Some of the boys, I won't mention any names, were running around in their underwear having pillow fights. Ah, the good old days.